Well, let's get started. So this is our lectionary Bible study. We're on Proper 17, and this will be the 11th Sunday after Trinity this go around. Make sure we're cooking on Facebook here too. Well, let's begin with the collect of the day. Let us pray. O Lord, we pray thee that thy grace may always prevent and follow us, and make us continually to be given to good works, through Jesus Christ, thy Son, our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee in the unity of the Holy Ghost, ever one God, world without end. Amen. So today in the collect, we talk about that wonderful concept of prevenient grace, the grace that goes out before us to pave the way. And it's really an undergirding of the idea that the whole spectrum of salvation from start to finish starts a long time before we even realize, that God has that foresight and ability to see things that we can't see and lay the groundwork. And also to undergird the idea that really all of this is due to God's grace, that we don't merit salvation, that salvation is a free gift that comes through his goodness, and that even the things that we feel like are our part really have God's work stamped all over it. Changing of minds and wrestling of judgment and doing our own research and talking to people and all this kind of stuff that we would think would be our own really are all spurned on by God and his activity, preparing our hearts, softening the hard ground of our hearts so that the seed of the gospel can get inside and all that kind of thing. And this is one that comes straight out of the old prayer book. I don't know if it goes back to the original Latin, but I would suspect that it perhaps does, simply because it's so brief and concise and to the point. And that's basically how the old Latin collects are, is that they're very concise, and their beauty really comes upon with play on words and the tension of different concepts and how things are expressed and the conciseness of it all.
What does that word may always prevent?
So prevent, that's an old-fangled fashioned word that we don't use that way anymore. We use the word prevent like stop. Mm-hmm. And of course, in that sense, it wouldn't make sense here. Grace doesn't stop us. Grace goes before. So that's what it really means, is that it means go before.
Okay.
Prevent.
I thought so, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah. And of course, in the contemporary versions, that's updated to something like go before. Okay. And we decided to keep it as it is in the old prayer books with the traditional language version. That it would be a teaching moment for those who don't know it, and then those who want the traditional language in the first place are probably already long familiar with it. The kind of themes that tie everything together for this go-around are pride and arrogance and the corresponding virtues of humility, and kind of a corollary of hospitality. And of course, pride is one of the 7 deadly sins or capital vices. Let's turn to Father Hardin's Catholic Dictionary. I usually bring out the pocket version, but it's fallen apart, so I pull out the hardback, which is the same. It's much bigger. It's just the pocket size is just pocket-sized, which confuses me because I look at the type and it's like it doesn't seem any different on the page. So I don't know. Maybe the pocket size has more pages, but there's cut small. I don't know. Anyway. So pride, he says, an inordinate, and that's a key word, inordinate, esteem of oneself. It is inordinate because it is contrary to the truth. It is essentially an act or disposition of the will, desiring to be considered better than a person really is. Pride may be expressed in different ways, by taking personal credit for gifts or possessions as if they had not been received from God, by glorying in achievements as if they were not primarily the result of divine goodness and grace, by minimizing one's defects or claiming qualities that are not actually possessed, by holding oneself superior to others or disdaining them because they lack what the proud person has, by magnifying the defects of others or dwelling on them. When pride is carried to the extent that a person is unwilling to acknowledge dependence on God and refuses to submit to his will, refuses to submit his or her will to God or lawful authority, then it's a grave sin. The gravity arises from the fact that a person shows contempt for God or for those who take his place, authority figures. Otherwise, pride is said to be imperfect and venially wrong. While not all sins are pride, it can lead to all sorts of sins, notably presumption, and I think presumption is probably the one that comes up most in our readings today. Ambition, vainglory, boasting, hypocrisy, strife, and disobedience. Pride strives for perverse excellence. It despises others, and depending on its perversity, even looks down upon God. The remedies for pride are sincere knowledge of oneself, the acceptance of daily humiliations, avoidance of even the least self-complacency, humble acknowledgement of one's faults, and prayerful communion with God. So the 7 deadly sins, envy, greed, gluttony, sloth, lust, anger, and pride, they all have their kind of corresponding virtues. And they're usually stem from appetites gone awry in some way.
Haywire.
Yeah.
Pride is at the very bottom of hell in Dante. And he says that in reality, all these other deadly sins come from pride.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I think Aquinas kind of pulls it out, and he puts vainglory in pride's place, and then he pulls out pride and makes that sort of the overarching queen of all vices or something like that. That self-love, self-interest is kind of the driving force behind anything that leads to rebellion against God. And I think it's perhaps best to think of it in terms of pride is about self-deception, and then its corresponding virtue, humility, is really about self-honesty. So we tend to think of humility, and it comes from the word humus, the ground, lowliness. We think of humility as like, beating up on yourself. But that's really kind of a mischaracterization. Humility is just self-honesty. So it's seeing yourself as you really are, as God knows you, and so on. So it's not necessarily thinking of yourself lower than you really are. It's just realizing how low you really are.
I've read in one of the Catholic books that in hell, prideful people are confused.
Interesting thought. Like, why am I here, kind of thing?
Well, they don't know what's going on. They had all the answers. They
Yeah.
knew what was going on, and now they
Don't.
just
They're
confused.
out of touch with reality, and then
Well,
reality
they're
hit
in
hard.
hell, and they don't know. They don't know God. They don't know anything else.
remember what Peter Creech says? Everybody in hell is singing, I did it my way.
Uh-huh.
So,
I did it.
I did it my way, but, so they are confused. They're like,
Yeah.
how did I get here? I was perfect.
And the culture of today doesn't value humility. It does value humiliation.
Yes.
We love that,
Yeah.
but not humility, not self-humiliation.
Yes, that's weak, isn't it?
Yeah. And of course, we have the Pride Month and that whole thing. But I think even more egregious is the more kind of subtler, self-esteem.
Yes.
I think in the 70s, I guess especially, the whole self-esteem movement. And unfortunately, most of it is really just a self-love movement. And it's the distinction between self-esteem and self-worth is very subtle, but it's also very dramatic. because self-worth is a virtue and self-esteem is a vice. So self-love is, when you basically idolize yourself and think of yourself as higher than you really are and so on. Whereas self-worth is trying to build value within yourself.
Well, self-worth comes from who your identity as God's child,
Mhm.
your worth in the world is from who you are in Him.
Yeah.
And self-esteem is who you are in your own eyes
Yeah.
and how the world sees you.
And self-worth builds connection with others. So, what do I have to offer to the world around me? And it's also kind of a tie-in when we talk about sort of good pride and bad pride. Pride can be a good thing, like I'm proud of my country or I'm proud of my family or whatever. But even then, you look at it carefully, good pride, what are you proud of? It's usually like things outside of your inner self. I'm proud of my country, I'm proud of my school, I'm proud of my family, I'm proud of... Even if you think about your accomplishments, even then it's usually like not things that are just for yourself. It's like, oh, I built this hospital. Oh, I wrote this book that other people can read and learn from. Good pride tends to be like self-worth, something that relates to others and turns you outside of yourself. Whereas the bad pride is one that turns you in on yourself, and you sort of collapse like the house at the end of Poltergeist, then disappears into some other dimension or something.
Or you diminish others.
Yeah. Well, and that's, the desire to buoy yourself up because you realize you're not quite as great as you thought, so you need to bring somebody else down in order to elevate yourself. Well, let's turn to the first lesson. So year C, proper 17, we're in Ecclesiasticus. That's the old-fashioned name for it. Some Bibles won't use that term anymore. So the Revised Standard Version, some copies will say Ecclesiasticus, some will say Sirach. The King James will say Ecclesiasticus. I guess the Douay Rheims will say Ecclesiasticus. I think all the other ones use the term Sirach. And that's perhaps a bit more helpful to the reader to distinguish between Ecclesiasticus and Ecclesiastes, because that always confuses people all over the place.
Easier to say.
Yes. And Ecclesiasticus means the church book. So it was, I don't know how it got that nickname, but it might have been between basically sort of the split between Jews and Christians as to what constitutes the Bible, or in our view, the Old Testament. Whereas at the Council of Jamnia, the rabbis decided that only Hebrew books would be accepted, and these Greek books were going to toss them. And they especially didn't like them because the Christians had them in their Bible, the Septuagint. And now, Ecclesiasticus, Sirach, along with some of the others, were originally written in Hebrew. But for whatever reason, they only seem to kind of prosper in Greek, perhaps just because that's the era that they came out of, where the Septuagint was the big one to get, and that's how they survived mostly. But we have found fragments in like the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Hebrew versions of Sirach and Tobit, some of the others from the Apocrypha. It is a collection of, it's obviously wisdom writing. It's a collection of parables and stories and just kind of litanies of good advice. Even has some, I think, acrostics in there in some places. So it's kind of a patchwork of material, but it's a little bit less cohesive than like the Book of Wisdom. So the Wisdom of Solomon is a bit more kind of narrative, whereas Sirach is more kind of patchwork. It's almost like a collection of things, they're written on a fortune cookie strip of paper, put all together.
Little maxims.
Yeah, maxims for wise living.
The famous maxims of the Rosh Hashanah, or just pieces of his wisdom, the
Yeah.
famous French. Well, pretty down to earth for even in life his bowels decay.
Is written by Jesus, son of Sirach, son of Eleazar. And from then whatever reason, Sirach was the name that sort of stuck as the title. And it has this little preamble talking about where it came from and how it was translated and so on. So we're in chapter 10, verses 7 through 18. Arrogance is hateful before the Lord and before men, and injustice is outrageous to both. Sovereignty passes from nation to nation on account of injustice and insolence and wealth. How can he who is dust and ashes be proud? For even if in life his bowels decay. A long illness baffles the physician. The king of today will die tomorrow. For when a man is dead, he will inherit creeping things and wild beasts and worms. The beginning of man's pride is to depart from the Lord. His heart has forsaken his Maker. For the beginning of pride is sin, and the man who clings to it pours out abominations. Therefore the Lord brought upon them extraordinary afflictions and destroyed them utterly. The Lord has cast down the throne of rulers and has seated the lowly in their place. The Lord has plucked up the roots of the nations and has planted the humble in their place. The Lord has overthrown the lands of the nations and has destroyed them to the foundations of the earth. He has removed some of them and destroyed them, and has extinguished the memory of them from the earth. Pride was not created for men, nor fierce anger for those born of women. So kind of a few main things to take note of in this passage. There's kind of two sections, one about the individual and one about nations or cultures. And it's kind of pointing out how pride is sort of unnatural. As he says there at the end, pride was not created for man. It's not inherent in who we are as human beings. It's something that comes in from the outside, from the invasion of sin and rebellion in the universe. Arrogance is hateful or despised by the Lord. It's not good. It's not holy. And he talks about the mortality of a human being. How can he who is dust and ashes be proud? And of course we see how, young people sometimes have that sort of air of invincibility around them. They do more risky things, because they don't perceive the fragility of life and dangers and so forth. Whereas someone who's a little older and more seasoned has been through some things in life, is a little less risky sometimes because of that. And I think this is picking up kind of on that idea. How can someone who is mortal, who obviously can just look around and see that, they are not a god. They're not someone who has all power. They're just a fragile thing that begins to fall apart before you know it. How can someone like that be proud? It just baffles the mind when you look at it logically. But of course, pride is not a logical thing in the first place. It's just more of an intuitive rebelliousness. So often when we encounter troubles with people and have arguments and we try to prove things by reason, and sometimes I have to remind myself, if reason were that important in the first place, we wouldn't be having an argument. You can't solve an emotional disagreement with logic. They're just two different things, two ships passing in the night. And then there's kind of a parallel thing with nations. Nations, cultures think of themselves in a prideful way, but they, just like a human being, fall apart. Sometimes God comes in and topples them and turns them over. There's a couple of quotes from C.S. Lewis that the CMJ commentator pulled out from Mere Christianity. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. Other vices may sometimes bring people together. You may find good fellowship and jokes and friendliness among drunken people or unchaste people. But pride always means enmity. It is enmity.
Amber.
And not only enmity between man and man, but enmity to God. Is that a Amber Alert?
Yeah.
It's an Amber
Yeah.
Alert, yeah.
I'm surprised mine hadn't gone off.
I've got rules.
Well, they all may go off over time.
Eventually,
Well, you can't, even when they're on silent,
No, mine's on silent, and it didn't,
yeah, I heard it. I heard
You did?
yours first.
well, it wasn't like his.
No.
Well, I thought it was around the corner in the office. I don't know.
I did get silent. I mean, I pressed silent to make.
Oh, cause I had mine on silent the other day,
It still blasts you.
when they were doing all the flooding stuff.
Oh, all the flooding, yeah.
It's
Oh, wow.
interesting that C.S. Lewis says that here that pride is essentially anger. He said pride is enmity.
Enmity, I guess.
Yeah. Not only enmity between man and man, but enmity toward God. And I think that makes sense in the idea that pride is not like some logical derivation that you act upon. It's just an impulse, a passion, an emotion, a rebelliousness, wanting to recreate the world in our own image, as it were, and not see things as they are, but as we would have them be. And then he addresses also the corresponding virtue of humility. If anyone would like to acquire humility, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud, and a biggish step, too. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. If you think you're not conceited, it means you are very conceited indeed. And that's an important thing to remember, is that everybody starts out with a certain bit of pride in the mix. You know, some more than others, of course, just because people have different personalities and different experiences and so on. But we all have pride there in the mix somewhere. And we all have a constant need to sort of grab the wheel and steer it back toward the middle, and reorient ourselves. And so we all need to humble ourselves kind of on a regular basis, lest God do it for us and humble us. Let me see, anything else to point out there? Sirach.
Well, I think an aspect of pride is to relinquish control. That it doesn't have to be your way.
Right.
Yeah.
Submit.
Submit.
So you mean humility is to
Humility, that's.
release control,
Yeah, well.
and pride is to
yeah,
want to
yeah, I
control
meant back,
everything, I
yeah.
guess. Yeah.
Want to control everything, and
Yeah.
you know that your kids can get along without your help, and the parents can get along without your
Yeah.
wise thing, and you know, letting go and let others, and
I mean, you think about, a parent who says to a child, you never be able to get along without me, or something like that. Just, what arrogance.
Yeah.
That's how this starts out. Arrogance is hateful before the Lord and before men. I mean, anybody, an outsider, can see how ridiculous that is. But yeah, people use their pride to control others around them all the time. Well, let's turn to the Psalm, Psalm 112. Oh, and the readings are all the same as the 79 lectionary, except for we take out the option in the first one. So in the 79 book, verses 7 through 11 or 12 are optional, and then on to 18 is mandatory. In the Roman Catholic lectionary, for whatever reason, they read from Sirach, but it's chapter 3, and it's like a couple of verses here and there. It sounds like it's on the same major subject, although it may be more on the humility side than the pride side, whereas we chose to have an excerpt on the pride side of the equation.
That's because Episcopalians are pride.
Yeah. So we thought we may need that admonishment more. Start at square one.
You know, they were always the last ones to come, and they didn't come till the railroad came, until the Pullman cars came to the west.
And then the original lectionary has Psalm 68. We have 112. And they have Hebrews. Do we have Hebrews chapter 13? Yeah, they have Hebrews chapter 12 later on in the letter. And then the gospel is the same. So let's look at the psalm. This is one of the praise psalms. It's not attributed. See anything else in my notes about it? Oh, it's an acrostic. It's paired with the psalm before it. And it kind of works as sort of a mirror image. So Psalm 111 is about the greatness of the Lord. And then Psalm 112 is kind of like the next step. It's about the greatness of the man of God. You know, so someone who wants to be godly, it praises them. And both of them are acrostics.
You mean in Hebrew?
In Hebrew, yeah. I mean, I don't know if anyone has ever tried to carry that over in translation, but I imagine that makes it almost impossible to pull off just because of the difference in language. You'd have to, you know, skew so far from the original meaning to make it work. Psalm 112, Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord, and hath great delight in his commandments. And it's almost like the beginning of the Psalter itself. It almost starts out exactly the same way. His seed shall be mighty upon earth. The generation of the faithful shall be blessed. Riches and plenteousness shall be in his house, and his righteousness endureth forever. Unto the godly there ariseth up light in the darkness. He is merciful, loving, and righteous. A good man is merciful, and lendeth. He will guide his words with discretion. For he shall never be moved, and the righteous shall be had in everlasting remembrance. He will not be afraid of any evil tidings, for his heart standeth fast, and believeth in the Lord. His heart is established, and will not shrink, until he see his desire upon his enemies. He hath dispersed abroad and given to the poor, and his righteousness remaineth forever. His horn shall be exalted with honor. The ungodly shall see it, and it shall grieve him. He shall gnash with his teeth and consume away. The desire of the ungodly shall perish. So overall, just a song of celebration for those who are godly and strive for holiness in life, recognize the greatness of God and try to reflect that in their own lives. And so, you talk about what is greatness. It's about wanting to be godly. It's about recognizing that greatness is something that belongs to the Lord and comes from above, and trying to be a mirror image of that. One thing that always throws me is established instead of established. Yeah, and I would have thought that the American prayer book would have Americanized that one. It did Americanize some things here and there, so there'll be a smattering of corrections or changes between the original Coverdale Psalter and the American version. But I'm surprised that one never made it. It means the same thing as establish. And in fact, I think establish is used in Britain today. I don't know if it updated at some point or what. It makes me think of Comptroller. I was confused by that, so I looked it up one day. And you know what definition of Comptroller is? Controller. So I'm like, well, why do they call it Comptroller?
Because it sounds more,
Well, yeah, sounds like a higher salary. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, my grandfather was comptroller of his corporation that he worked for, among other things. He was one of the first office employees in the company that was founded in For some reason, I never have quite understood it. I mean, I do have understood it, but because it's their familial tradition. But my grandfather, I'm sure, was not prideful because I have a little autobiographical sketch of his, and he started working at the First Methodist Church in Oxford, Alabama, where he was born, and he had to get up in the morning and change the oil or whatever, change get all the oil lamps ready to day. And if they were having a baptism, he had to pump the water in and out of the baptistry, and just as a young man, and but for some reason, and then he married, and he had a good job, and stayed with the same corporation for 50 years or whatever. He had 6 girls, and I think if you've got 6 girls, the family's going to become prideful. The honor of the family is going to become very, very important.
When you mentioned pumping the water for the baptism, it made me think back to when I was a curate at All Saints, and we did a immersion baptism for a teenage girl, and they were from a Church of Christ family, and so because of the extended family, they wanted all the kids baptized by immersion so that the rest of the family considered it legit, I guess. And so one of our members had a kind of a ranch thing, and they had a horse trough. And ironically, the horse trough was never used for horses. It was bought for horses, but it only ever, as far as I know, ended up being used for baptisms for all these kids. So they brought it up, and we put it in there and kind of put some flowers around it. And so I was filling it up, and we first put the hose in there, but then we're like, this water is like 60 degrees. That's not going to work. So then for like the next couple of hours, Father Ogacho and I were running back and forth to the sacristy down the hallway with pitchers of hot water from the sink, filling this thing up gradually.
It's horse trough.
Yeah.
One time we had a baptism at St. Paul's. The couple, for some reason, wanted in the Orthodox fashion, to have the baby dunked all the way down in,
Mhm.
and out 3 times, and we set up a wash tub back at the baptistry. I can't remember whether we put it on top of the font itself, but did a good sized font back at the back. But yeah, and it was just in and out.
3 times, yeah.
Pruitt Avenue Baptist Church, baptistry was up front,
Oh, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
on top.
Park Cities, it's red stuff, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, in mine there was a stained glass window in the center, and then there's kind of a passageway between the window and the front wall. And so it was right there. And I remember I was 10. I remember thinking how warm the water was. I'm like,
How's
well,
that?
this is pleasant up here. I'll take a little soak. You know? It's nice.
Now, when you're young.
Well, they didn't consider I was, the Baptists didn't consider I was baptized because I'd been sprinkled in the Catholic Church. Among my other shortcomings.
Yeah, my friend is, she's a Catholic, and she's married to a Baptist, and they started going to a Baptist church, and they told her that to become a member, she needed to be baptized. And she said, I was baptized as an infant, and they were like, that doesn't count.
Yeah.
Well, it counted for me,
Yeah.
so I won't be a member of your church.
Yeah.
I'll just come, so.
And there's a strange disparity of no, baptism doesn't count for anything. We don't consider it necessary for salvation. But if you are going to be baptized, you absolutely have to do it one way.
Yeah.
Whereas the others, it's absolutely necessary for salvation, but you can do it kind of any way you want to.
Yeah.
Well, not any way you want to, but. Well, our epistle comes from Hebrews, and we've been kind of going through Hebrews bit by bit, not quite back to back, but fairly close. We're getting toward the end of the book, so it wraps up here in chapter 13, which we begin. And I think we picked up in chapter 11 with the kind of Faith Hall of Fame, and then continued on after that. I haven't looked ahead, but this might be the last time we're in Hebrews. Chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are ill-treated, since you also are in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. For God will judge the immoral and adulterous. Keep your life free from the love of money, and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never fail you, nor forsake you. Hence we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their life, and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same, yesterday and today and forever. And we kind of had a bookends of very famous verses there. So of course the last one, very famous, and then I think verse 2, don't neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. I'm always kind of puzzled that that's not paired with the three angels visiting Abraham in Genesis.
Does this have any new lines in it?
Hmm?
Does this have any new lines in it?
No, I think that's the same. Yeah, everything's the same except for the first reading. The option is taken out and made mandatory. And this one, especially coming at the end of the letter, as is the case in a lot of the other letters, kind of the last chapter or so is just sort of a big grab bag of very short things, little axioms and say hello to so-and-so and that kind of thing. So here we have pretty much every verse is almost like an independent entity here. I'm curious what we left off with before, because it begins with almost like a transition. Let brotherly love continue. So in chapter 12, the section at the end of the chapter is called Penalties of Disobedience. And that begins with strive for peace with everyone. In fact, this was our lesson last time. Strive for peace and for the holiness without which no one can see the Lord. Make amends, patch things up. So in that vein, we have this little transition. It's almost kind of surprising that they didn't put that verse at the end of the last chapter. Because, of course, all the chapter divisions and verses come much, much, much later. But we pick up kind of where we left off last time. Let brotherly love continue. And then we get into the individual things. Show hospitality to strangers. And that's kind of a corollary to the major theme of pride and humility. So humility directs us out toward others, whereas pride is directed inward. And so showing hospitality to strangers is something that's kind of humbling. It's turning your attention out toward others rather than yourselves. It's putting someone else ahead of yourselves. And it sort of implies here there's reward in that. It may feel like it's a downer, but don't worry. Some have even entertained angels unaware. You never know where this is going to lead. You never know what kind of reward might lay ahead for good works like these. Of course, hospitality, very big value in the ancient world and in many parts of the world today. Remember those who are in prison. Verse 3. I've only visited someone in prison once, and that's mainly just because that's the only person I've ever had any connection with that's been in prison. I guess I could go visit a stranger in prison. I've never been involved in Kairos ministry although I'm open to it. And it was weird. It was like just on TV, where you go in and you sit and there's the glass partition. Is like pick up the phone and then it's what the really strange thing is it sounds like this person is on the other side of the planet. It's the most distant sounding voice when they're sitting right in front of you.
But not every
Yeah.
prison situation is like that.
No.
A friend of mine is in.
And I think I visited him at the jail, and that may be
Yeah.
different from actually visiting somebody
The
in
prison
prison.
ministry, a friend of mine was in the prison ministry for years, and they went, and everybody came to the room where they were. They had a prayer service. They,
Mhm.
read scripture, and everybody was all sitting there in the same room.
Yeah.
People were all handcuffed. or-
No,
No.
no, I mean, nobody had to come, obviously, and so everybody who was there wanted to participate, or at least get out of their cells, or
Yeah.
whatever.
When I was talking with a priest who moved down here from Illinois, and he was talking about he had been involved in Kairos up there, and he wanted to get involved in it again. I guess they kind of tightened up on that during the pandemic, and now they're going back to normal. But he said that like up in that state, you couldn't bring in anything from the outside. So like you couldn't bring in your Bible, you couldn't bring in a plate of cookies or anything. You had to tell them what you want, and they'll get it for you. And so they're like, when we went in there, we'd want to have a cake, so we told them then we'd like a cake, and so like the prison cafeteria made a cake, but down here you can bring stuff in, so you can bring in cookies and things to share.
We learned,
It's a total
And that'll
Tom
get
Bell-
people out of the cell. I'm here for the cookies,
Right.
and that's what they want.
Remember when somebody made
cookies.
cookies with powdered sugar on them,
Mm.
and they got rejected forthwith.
Yeah.
I think they inspect what you have, and Tom said
Oh, sure.
that just went in the trash so fast it made your head swim, because it could have been dusted with cocaine. You can feel the spirit. Anyway, sorry.
So it's just another being mindful of other people. And then verse 4, let marriage be held in honor among all. And so you're operating in, well, I guess an environment that's not too different from today, where there's a lot of different values about marriage and chastity. And so this is basically don't be worldly like the pagans around you. But let marriage be something that's honored and prized and valued and important for you. The more important something is, the more it's kind of worth doing it right the first time, And so the higher value you put on things, the better you treat it.
Well, when my mother was training me for altar call back in
Olden
10
days.
that was one of the things that she started with was, just, you're not haphazard about this in
Mhm.
any way. This is important stuff.
Mm.
And that always stuck with me.
And that kind of has to be cultivated, and repeatedly so, because if you don't, then you just, little by little, things start to get kind of lax here and there, and, Discipline. Keep your life free from the love of money. Of course, Paul had said that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And so here, that's probably another indication of, or reason why some people ascribe this letter to Paul. Another very Pauline thing, because he said exactly the same thing in another letter. Although I think that other letter is what scholars say wasn't written by Paul, so I guess
Those scholars.
you can throw that one out the window.
What do they know?
But I think the real key to that verse is be content with what you have. And that really ties in with the pride. The pride is always reaching for more, for being discontent with who you really are and wanting to be something more.
'Cause
Being-
you really deserve it, right?
Yeah.
Or your wife, or husband.
Mhm. how can we confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid? What can man do to me? It's a, I always say that a rhetorical question deserves a rhetorical answer because I may not know the answer. I think the idea there is that how can you say,
Not
I'm
how.
so confident, nothing will go wrong?
Hence. So we can confident, it's not how can we say, it's hence.
Oh, hence we can confidently
Yes.
say, yes,
Makes
the
it-
Lord is my helper. I was thrown by the question mark there at the end. So we can be confident, for he said, I will never fail you or forsake you. So rather than placing all our trust in ourselves, we're placing it in God. Remember your leaders, pray for your leaders, respect your leaders, bolster your leaders, help them become better leaders.
Need to work on that. Better leaders.
Well, and we've, like they say, trust is built up very, very gradually and can be destroyed in an instant. So we've had so many bad leaders and leaders not worthy of trust. It makes it hard. I mean, I would tell people, don't ever just believe somebody just because they're dressed like this,
Like a politician.
Yeah.
Are you talking about clergy, are you talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, take the take the same strategy we did with the Soviets. Trust but verify.
Yeah.
Just look it up. In fact, Paul himself said, talking about the church in Berea, I counted you more noble because you took that approach. You listened to me, and you're like, okay, we're going to look it up. We're going to study what you said and make sure that it's real, And we're in that kind of environment today where we just can't trust somebody just because they have a MDiv diploma on their wall or they're dressed like clergy or who knows what's going to come out of their mouth. And then the wonderful verse there, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And there's a whole section of kind of avant-garde theology. It talks about change in God. And it's really trying to bolster sort of a modernist approach about, well, if there's change in God, then we can have change in doctrine and morals. And so it's kind of trying to shiv a little opening there. But here, it's not so much like, well, there's no change in God. I mean, you can say, well, Jesus was born and he grew older and his bones got bigger and his hair grew out, and that change in God. Well, what this is talking about here is his character, that God is consistent, that he's reliable. He's not going to turn around and be some different person from one moment to the next. And in fact, that kind of comes out of what we had said earlier, where God says, I will never fail you nor forsake you. He's consistent. He's reliable. We can trust him. The Lord is my helper. I won't be afraid. What can man do to me? Well, let's turn to the Gospel, Luke 14. And we've been going through the Gospel of Luke. And we're skipping over a little bit here. He's given us some parables. Last time we had the narrow door. And then right after that we have a little kind of narrative interlude about Herod. He wants to kill Jesus, so it's kind of like the heat is rising. And there's more and more kind of a consciousness about he's headed toward Jerusalem. He's headed toward kind of a climax there. And he laments over Jerusalem. And then he heals a man on the Sabbath, a man with dropsy. And then we pick up here, we get a little introduction of the scene with verse 1, and then we pick up the story with verse 7 through 14. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to dine at the house of a ruler who belonged to the Pharisees, they were watching him. Then we skip to verse 7. Now he told a parable to those who were invited, when he marked how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, "When you are invited by anyone to a marriage feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest a more eminent man than you be invited by him, and he who invited you both will come and say to you, 'Give place to this man,' and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, go up higher,' and then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." He said also to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your kinsmen or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. You will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." So basically 2 different parables, kind of overlapping themes. And this clincher verse, in verse 11, we also get with the story of the 2 men who went to the temple to pray, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So an admonition against pride and trying to point us toward humility, lest we have to be humbled by God rather than humbling ourselves. Pride, or we should say social regard and social shame, is still a very big thing in a lot of cultures around the world, and it was a very big thing in the ancient Near East. So in first century Israel, honor and shame are a big deal and highly motivating to different kinds of behaviors. So he's basically saying, don't open yourself up to public shame. Take the humble approach. Because when you venture out, when you go out on a limb and think of yourself too highly, you're opening yourself up to public shame. You're opening yourself up to the possibility of being humbled by others, or you might say, humiliated by others. What parallels would there be today? Perhaps don't go be too boastful on Twitter or something because somebody's going to knock you down. They'll probably knock you down anyway, no matter what you say.
Right.
Well, at the same time, you shouldn't let that discourage you from doing something right. Like if I make a video on something controversial, I'll get comments. That's basically the only time I ever get comments on YouTube videos is if it's something controversial. So they'll say, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. But I shouldn't let that discourage me from, doing some teaching to say, well, somebody's going to insult me. I don't want to do that.
Well, Bishop Barron says, hey, they're watching. At least they're watching.
Mhm.
Yay. Why are they watching it if they think you're, you know what I mean? So good for you. Somebody's watching you. They might not agree with you, but they are watching.
They might think you're an idiot, but they're watching.
That's good.
And it furthers a conversation, at least.
Are they noticing every time you do something good sometimes, there are people who just,
Proud.
well, if, sometimes I think something personal, let's say, weather's bad or late night or something, and I'm at church, we go to church, and almost just wait for you to, and they're disappointed when you do something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what makes sense.
It's like, well, that's how I feel every Sunday when I leave my house to go to church. I'm dressed up. I might be the only one in the whole neighborhood that goes out to my car every every Sunday morning gets in and goes to church, and I'm like, hey, you know what? If they're all watching me, good on them. Let me be a witness for you, you know? Even if they think I'm an idiot, just let me be a witness.
Yeah,
So.
I'm the only one, and
My
we
grandson
are the
was
only
walking
ones in our
my neighbors
neighborhood.
out walking their dogs, and I waved at them.
Heathens, no.
Yeah, I'm the only one in our neighbor, we are the only ones in our neighborhood. who-
Get that bumper sticker, follow me to church.
Should.
I've never seen that one. Have you?
Well, I think there was one that was kind of specialized, follow me to Columbus
Oh, yeah.
Avenue Baptist Church or
Yeah,
something.
yeah. I've seen something similar to that.
But, interestingly, that we were, my family, we moved to Dallas. Although we visited other churches because we weren't sure what, my parents weren't sure where they wanted to go. But we ended up Park Cities Baptist Church because some neighbors up in the next block up, somehow or another, got to know my parents and invited us to Park Cities. And after we'd been in Park Cities a few Sundays, I said to my parents, I actually said to my parents, I want to go to this church.
And you were just a boy.
And I was nine.
And is that where you were baptized? Because you said you were baptized at 9.
Yeah, Park Cities Baptist Church.
Okay.
And
Dr. Howard?
up to Howard, or Dr. Howard.
Well, we talked about, what can we learn from this parable, and we're thinking immediately of kind of social interactions. Father Fuller in his commentary says, since it's a parable, it must not be interpreted as a piece of worldly wisdom, or even as a lesson in humility, as usually understood, and deals rather with an aspect of one's relationship with God. God, in the person of Jesus, is inviting all people to the Messianic feast. The only way to respond to this invitation is to renounce any claim of merit on one's own. So to assume the lowest place, I guess. So salvation has to be accepted as an unmerited gift. People's final acceptance at the Messianic banquet depends on their acceptance of others now. Forgive, and God will forgive you. So it's addressing humility not so much in a targeted way toward your interaction with others, but in the first place in your interaction with God, is what he says is the main point of this parable. So it's not about a lesson in social interaction as much it is an example of social interaction as a lesson for our relationship with God. So I guess the question would be, what would be a modern day example?
Yeah, it's hard to
Parallel
imagine
example.
Only in the most, I guess some sort of formal banquet or something, and you go up and sit at the head table, and you have to be moved off the head table to sit someplace else.
Yeah, I don't know.
Or joining a new organization and thinking that you have some kind of knowledge that they need to have, and they kind of put you in your place because they got it. You don't need to worry. Or the opposite, joining an organization and trying to do it their way. I don't know, that doesn't really fit as well.
Or maybe don't call up the news channel offering a quote when they're like, we don't care what you have to say, who are
Right,
you?
That's right.
Well, I mean, I'm honestly, I had to keep a low profile when I first came to St. Francis,
Mhm.
because I'd been trained at St. Paul's and came here to St. Francis, and they really didn't do it.
We were
the way-
yokels.
Oh, yeah.
I was gonna say, you didn't really stomp around and go.
We were the country bumpkins.
They didn't do it the same way we did it. And
Well, instructing the ignorant is a corporal work of mercy.
They weren't
Well, I had an experience with one woman, like over and over woman at St. Lawrence decided that I did not know how to do church.
Yes.
And
How to do church.
how to do church. And,
St. Lawrence way.
and so she kept correcting me. And
What do you mean, like how to sit in the pew, or how to sing hymns, or what?
You don't ever leave Mass until the candles are out.
Oh,
Or we don't sit down until X, you know. And so one day I had to leave, like, right when the party exited, I got up to leave. And she was like, wait. And I said, I have been an Episcopalian for my entire life. You do not need to tell me how to do church. I can do it. I know how to do it. But also, because what I thought was, y'all don't even do it like I did it growing up, you know? So don't tell me that this is the way to do it. This is just what you like. And, you know, I learned a lot of valuable lessons here about don't idolize your church. It is not about this place, you know, because people really did idolize Father Rogers and the parrot, you know, this was the place. And I see that in her, where I think she does love God, but I think she idolizes that parish to the point that it's the only place that does it, you know, the right way. So I served on one event with her, and she told me, she came out and she was like, I said, what do I need to do? Well, we need to set the table. I said, okay. And I went out and started setting the table. And I said, she said, oh, I need to show you how to do it. I need to show you how to do it. I said, I'm 58 years old. I know how to set a table. Well, not like we do it. And so she showed me it was exactly what I had been doing. And I thought, okay, I just need to steer clear of you. Really far from you. But every parish has that, you know. And I don't want to disparage anybody, but Lois, that was Lois. She owned the sacristy, and you didn't do anything, nothing back there without her permission, knowledge, whatever.
Well,
I grew up here.
I can't imagine Nesia Thor asking Lois's permission to do anything.
Oh, yeah.
well, she might have been given the green light, you know, sometime before. I guess the universal principle is, you know, don't just make yourself at home without being welcomed first. So it's like in this thing, don't go sit in the first seat,
Right.
you know, until you've been given some indication.
Well, I never told an altar guild woman here at St. Francis the first 2 or 3 years I was here what
What
I
we were
thought-
doing
what I-
wrong.
What they're doing
what I thought they ought to be- what I thought they ought to be doing. Now there were a number of instances when someone else told Nesia Thor, we don't do it that way anymore.
Yeah.
Just for instance, they had a
He's gonna tell us.
they had a metal trough built for Christmas for the altar, and it had a slanted trough so that they could put poinsettias in
Oh,
with flowers facing out.
yeah.
And then it
That
had
makes sense.
it had 3 candle sockets in each one of the troughs. I mean, I never did know, I didn't pay any attention to what the altar looked like up there. I mean, I wasn't doing anything back then, but one Christmas, they started to put up those troughs, and I think it was Father Edwards, I'm not sure, but I think it was Father Edwards says, no, we're not using these. We don't substitute something for the candlesticks on the altar. There are 3 candlesticks on the altar, and you can do the flowers however, you know, Father Rogers.
However they fit in with
Yeah,
these
That's
3
right.
candlesticks.
And oh boy, I'm telling you.
Father Edwards, he
And
was
so
a
we had
mess.
lots of fun when we switched over to the full Easter Holy and again, when we had no flowers back in the baptistry, and we had baptisms in those days, Nelia said, huh, I wouldn't want any of my children baptized with no flowers back here.
When I was growing up, somebody, maybe it was you that said that they didn't believe that we ever did it this way, but we went to, Maundy Thursday and went home. We went to the Good Friday and went home. And by the way, I could not believe that any church in America would do Good Friday at night. You do it in the afternoon, because that's when it was all happening, right? That's how we did it.
That was
And then
tradition.
we came for the vigil at like 7 o'clock on Saturday night. Everybody went home. And then we came back for Sunday morning. There was no mass Saturday night. It was just the vigil. We went home.
Mhm.
So I grew up that way. Now, I don't think it was my parents just taking us all home at the end. I don't think so, because we all sat. I sat with my friends and everything. But
Well, I mean, I do remember, and usually when there were changes, I mean, it wasn't my place to force any changes, but when changes were forced, it was usually either Father Rogers or Bill McPeters when he became curate, or Father Edwards when he was the curate, who said, no, we don't do it this way. Which was the same way that I would have said, no, we don't do it, but I never said it.
Better them to say it than.
I never
yeah.
said it.